Me being the introducer this time and her being the
introducee, a word we coined right here.
You can always come up with new things.
As we learned.
This is a free world.
So she says.
Yeah, so in this episode we're gonna talk about carbon footprint. We have talked about climate change, we have talked about what causes climate change. Now we are gonna talk about how one individually can cause climate change. What is your contribution to climate change? So take us off, Karemi.
Oh, nice. So now today we're going to be talking about carbon. Today we're going to be talking about carbon footprint. So we're going to start by defining what carbon footprint is. And carbon footprint is just basically the culmination of the amount of carbon that a person releases and uses from the atmosphere, from the environment in itself. Tutaanza kwa kusema carbon exists naturally.
Yeah.
Carbon is released naturally. It exists naturally in the air. And I think that everyone that knows a little bit of biology and knows a little bit of science knows that carbon exists.
Yeah.
So at what point do we start calculating the footprint?
Yeah.
So first of all, let's understand what a footprint is. This word was, it was coined in the early 21st century. And the aim was so that it can describe the total amount of gases, the greenhouse gases, that are produced directly or indirectly by human interactions. Yeah. So as the people in this room, we can all calculate the amount of carbon that we in this room are producing.
How are we contributing to the CO2 that is released in the atmosphere?
Yeah. In podcast number 2, I think, we talked about the causes of climate change. And we talked about global warming. And we said how the gases that normally go to the atmosphere create some sort of blanket. And I used my microphone as my earth. Now, we are trying to understand in this particular podcast, how does an individual, me, as Wangeshi Karemi, how do I help in producing the amount of greenhouse gases by the end of the day? Directly and indirectly. Yeah. The activities that I do, the actions that I take, the foods that I eat, yada, how do they, by the end of the day, translate into carbon to the atmosphere? Mm-hmm. And that is the definition of your carbon footprint. Yeah. So when I say your carbon footprint, because I am talking about the activities, the amount of carbon that you produce by the end of the day, and what produces this carbon. Yeah. That's your footprint. In the simplest terms possible. Yes.
Yeah. So we do daily, everyday activities that contribute to this carbon in the atmosphere. That is carbon CO2 and CO. That is carbon monoxide. One of the factors that we have that is greatly debated is our diet. Right. Mm-hmm. Our diet. We have on one end we have people that eat meat. On the other end we have
just vegans. Use the right ends.
On the right hand we have people that eat meat. On the left hand,
we have people that don't eat meat. People that don't eat animals. People that allow.
People that don't eat. People that don't eat things with
anything that has a face on it.
Nah. She and Phoebe. Same what's up.
Me and Phoebe. Same what's up.
Yeah, we should watch Friends. So anyway, the argument for our diet is this: that if you're eating meat, mm-hmm. Meat, animals connected with methane.
I normally avoid to have that discussion because it has both sides, and I have not found any of the sides that I lean to, particularly because non-meat eaters and meat eaters all say, because essentially how it goes is, animals, they produce their waste. Mm-hmm. Produces a lot of methane by the end of the day, and that methane is part of the production of the greenhouse gases. So how do you deal with that situation itself? You eat all of them. That's one argument. But then there's also the argument of the biodiversity, mm-hmm. where different ecosystems and different species have different niches and different roles in every ecosystem. Yeah. So the biodiversity is very essential. That means there is no reason to get rid of any of the animals, mm-hmm. including the cattle and the sheep and the goats. Mm-hmm. So there's a discussion in Spain the other day, and they were having this conversation. They were saying how they should rid the country of its cattle, because the cattle produces a lot of methane, and it leads to climate change. But then there's a question of, what happens to humane action? What happens to animal rights? Are we going to ignore all of that in the name of climate change? That is why I don't have that discussion. But in all essence, the diet is normally a big concern, because we always ask the question of at this particular point in time, what are we fighting for? Are we fighting for human rights, anthropogenic? Are we looking at it from an anthropogenic point of view? Are we looking at it from the point of human beings are superior species to other species?
Yeah.
Or are we looking at it from a point where we ecocentric view, where we exist to
Live with animals.
live with animals, cohabitate with them?
Yeah.
Is it how we're going to look at it when it comes to the discussion of diet in the production of carbon? And if you ask me as an individual, and this is a little more sophisticated, I will always say there are some places where you can't read of carbon. You can't stop producing that carbon. There are places where your carbon footprint is always going to be high. And then now we're going to talk about the places where you can actually reduce carbon. And we're going to be talking about, in this podcast, we're going to talk about carbon emission reduction activities. Where if you can produce this amount of carbon in the amount of diet that you eat, then you can reduce the amount of carbon in other activities that you do. Yeah, then you create some sort of balance. So carbon emission reduction activities are equally as important. That's not what we're talking about. I'm sorry. So well, some other activity that normally leads to carbon is transport. The amount of carbon that is emitted by transportation automobiles, the Nganyas, the Matatus, the Mercedes Benz, that's big car that you own, varies, of course, but all of these vehicles have some sort of carbon to the atmosphere. Every single time you transport from one place to the other using this automobile, including the trains and the aeroplanes, the helicopters, and all of them. Every single time there's some sort of transport that has happened up to this very day, including the electric vehicles, they all have some sort of carbon that they are releasing to the environment. During the manufacture of electric vehicles, there's a lot of carbon that is used, because essentially most of it requires the use of coal.
Yeah.
And it is important for us to recognize, even if electric vehicles are the future that we want, during their production, there's a lot of carbon that is released to the atmosphere.
Sure.
During the usage of these other vehicles that use the internal combustion engine, there is also production of a lot of carbon.
We're burning fuel.
There's burning of fuels, and it burns every single day.
Burning fuel.
Yes, so there's production of carbon. And how essentially, when we normally, as environmentalists, when we advocate for people to reduce the amount of carbon in the atmosphere, we normally say one method you can use is carpooling.
Yeah.
So how does that work? I'm just going to give a very basic example. And this is not data that is on ground. This is just to help with your understanding. I'm going to use facts and figures that are not facts. I'm going to use figures that are not statistically true right now. Say a saloon car, every single time it goes for a mile, it produces 100 units of carbon. And then Matatu produces 150. And then Nganya produces 200, right? Every single time an individual takes that saloon car and goes for a mile, they, in their carbon footprint, in their personal individual carbon footprint, they have produced 100 units of carbon. Say 14 people get into a Matatu that produces 150. So say your maths, to say 15 people.
Yeah.
So 15 people get into a Matatu and they go for a mile. In a Matatu that produces 150 units of carbon every mile, they have produced, by the end of the day, just basic mathematics, 10 units of carbon. See the difference? So if you're driving yourself and you're alone in that vehicle, the amount of carbon that is going to be produced by that vehicle automatically becomes part of your individual carbon footprint, right? So now it's Anganya. Anganya is producing, let's just give it a value like 300. Anganya is producing 300 units of carbon. How many people does Anganya have? 15. 30, 70. How many?
We know a normal Matatu has 14. Anganya would probably have 44 or 34.
Let's
say
say
34. That's a lot
34.
of people in one single vehicle. At the end of the day, you have reduced your carbon footprint.
Yes.
Because you have used essentially like one. Like
you've used less than 10 units of carbon. So that's why we call for carpooling. So by the end of the day, if everybody was to drive there, if 10 people were to drive their own saloon cars, producing 100 units of carbon per mile, every mile we are going to have 1,000 units of carbon produced to the atmosphere. Every single time they carpool, someone else gets into that car, that carbon footprint is divided. So transport is another way we can measure your individual carbon footprint by the end of the day. What is another way?
Well,
diet, transport.
Carpooling, I'd say carpooling is you have your own car and then you know
Carry your
carry your
neighbors.
neighbors. And then I divide that, and then public transport would be, different for me. I mean, people in the Western countries use trains and whatever that carry so many people.
So many people, yeah.
At once. So I'd say use of public transport.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Another way you can like think about your carbon footprints. I just thought of this one is energy. How you cook your food. Of course, we talked about the diet and we said the non-meat eaters, and we had that whole controversial conversation over there. But essentially, when it comes to diet, how you cook your food also matters. The amount of the type of fuel that you're using during its production, how much carbon was released to the atmosphere. People just be like, big gas ain't releasing carbon into the atmosphere. Every type of fuel right now releases some sort of carbon, either during its production, either during its usage, yada 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 yada. So even people who cut down trees. Sorry. I was just my own wall. wanting to attack people who like live in urban centers, and they always judge people who cut down trees for wood
because they use gas.
Because they use gas, yeah. And you think gas
essentially.
Where is the worst?
When you go mining for these fuels or these non-renewable sources, you are literally unearthing carbon. That is like carbon that is stored before you are unearthing it.
Yeah.
You are the greatest.
Yeah, I know.
You're the greatest contributor.
You're the greatest contributor. Actually, natural gas right now, the so-called natural gas, comes from nature. Okay? When we mine fossil fuels, this is kina coal, kina oil, kina natural gas. By the end of the day, we are unearthing the carbon that is stored in the natural things. The one that's when we talked about climate change in our previous podcast, please go watch that if you haven't watched that. Bikoro told us about the natural causes, the ones that normally happen when volcanic eruptions happen. Now that carbon that is normally stored, that is normally released when volcanic eruptions happen and other natural occurrences, is normally it's normally artificially produced when we mine for coal, for oil, and for natural gas.
Because you're literally unearthing what was stored. Yes.
Unaitoa kwenye dunia yetu ambayo ni mviringo. Unaitoa. And so when you do that, those people that use natural gas, do you use natural gas in your house?
I don't cook. Girls don't use gas. Yes, I do. I use natural gas.
Gas? Don't eat?
Yes, I use natural gas.
Girls don't... Okay. Yes, she uses natural gas. So essentially when we are calculating Bikoro's carbon footprint, we would be looking at what she uses to cook. I use ethanol. Yeah. Just bragging.
You think you're cleaner?
I mean, yes, that you. Right. Yes.
You're right.
I am. So there's a lot of things. When you look at an environmentalist who is living a completely sustainable life, what they're trying to do is reduce the amount of consumption of carbon. And in this case, essentially, natural gas would be one of the no-nos. Yeah. And then also your diet would matter.
Yeah.
Yeah, but let's just say this so that vegetarians are not helping with climate change by not eating animals. I'm a vegetarian, and let's not do that. Let's not bring that argument on. But there's a reason we don't eat animals, but it's not because of climate change. All right. So another way you would look at diet again, like the food you eat, is where did it come from? Yeah. So many people in urban centers they forget where the food comes from. It comes from the upcountry places, like here. This is to the cameraman who said, "I live in the end of the world."
She lives at the end of the world.
Anyway, yeah, so in all essence, if your food travels miles, then you have to include that when you're calculating your carbon footprint. I have to repeat this. Carbon footprint is the amount of carbon that you as an individual is giving to the atmosphere, yeah? And by the end of the day, we are saying too much carbon over there is what is causing all of these problems and why we are having this discussion. So if you're producing too much carbon as an individual, so your food is sourced out from overseas, that food comes and it has calculated carbon within it, you know? Your food comes from, where else could food come from? Apart from here, where I live, where we are the source of food.
What is? Importation.
Importation.
Yeah.
Yeah, so all of those things are things that you take into consideration when you're calculating the kind of carbon. Yeah. And also like the things that you use in your house, like the furniture in your house, where was it created? What was used to create the furniture in your house? How many trees were cut? Were they planted again? if you have furniture that is made of wood and the trees were cut and they were not planted, that is you adding carbon into the atmosphere.
That is true. Another great contributor is the aerosol sprays. Aerosol sprays.
Aerosol sprays.
Um,
Aerosol sprays.
The aerosol sprays. What did I just say? Anything that
The chemicals that are sprayed, yeah.
Yeah, whatever is added there to just enable the spraying factor contributes to your carbon footprint as well.
Yeah, so it's all the things that you use by the end of the day, directly or indirectly to add on to the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. Everything. It's everything. It's the amount of electricity you use, the kind of electricity you use, what energy do you use to cook, where does it come from, how much water, you're a water analyst, how much water really matters by the end of the day. There's also farmers who, the swamp things, they try and make a swamp dry land. That is also you not assisting in the sequestration of carbon. In the sequestration of carbon. So by the end of the day, your carbon footprint should include that.
Yeah, and you can calculate your carbon footprint you can go on Google and just Google carbon calculator and get your contribution to climate change. Yeah.
You as an individual. So it's not just the world.
You are a contributor.
You are a major contributor to carbon.
I am a contributor. She is.
I am a contributor to carbon. Even if we know all of these things, we try every single day. What do you do to reduce the amount of carbon that you release to the environment?
Well, for starters, public transport.
Yeah. Is it a choice? It's important to know that because something else we'll have a conversation about in this same podcast, but on a different day, is environmental economics. Are you reducing this amount of carbon, or is your carbon footprint lower because you can't afford to have it higher? Or because
you want to, or is it because you have to?
Is it because you have to? Yeah. That's a very important way to look at it.
So that was our podcast today. We have so far we have talked about climate change, introduced it. We talked about its causes, and now we have talked about our individual contribution. So next we're gonna talk about how we're gonna, what? We're talking about carbon credits next. So we're gonna see how we're gonna manage our individual
carbon footprints. Not necessarily, but you can start with individual. There's a whole aspect of the personal carbon trading, how you and I can trade our carbon. But that is a discussion that we're going to have in our next podcast. Make sure you don't miss out.
See you then.
Bye.
Bye.